Okay, moving on to the first lesson for today. We're looking at page 35 of your packet. So flip there now, please. We're going to be talking about a new type of line in your triangles. This time we're not talking about a point of concurrency though. I am going to have 3 of these segments, and these segments are called mid-segments. A mid-segment of a triangle is a segment that joins the midpoints of 2 sides of the triangle. So when I'm looking at this image on the bottom, I have a mid-segment going from X to Z, and I know that because I have midpoint X. I can tell because of the 2 tick marks. I have midpoint Z. I know that because of those tick marks. I also have mid-segment ZY. Again, it goes from midpoint Z to midpoint Y. I also have mid-segment XY because it goes from midpoint X to midpoint Y. When I combine all 3 mid-segments, I create the mid-segment triangle. Good? Great. Next slide. While they do not have a point of concurrency, notice that they are not concurrent, they do actually give us some information. What we know once we've identified that we have a mid-segment is that the mid-segment is going to be parallel to the side of the triangle it was not attached to. So in this picture, mid-segment DE turns out to be parallel to side AC. And just so you know, whenever you see this symbol on a pair of lines, it means that they're parallel to each other. So be familiar with those symbols, that little arrow-looking thing. That's telling me that they're parallel. Okay, once I know that I have parallel sides, I know that the mid-segment's length is worth half of the length of the side it's parallel to, which means, in a sense, the opposite of that is also true. The length of the side is equal to 2 times the length of the mid-segment. Hopefully that makes sense. And if it does, let's move on. That's literally the new content for this section. We're now just going to practice it. All right, so to start on this slide, you can actually cross out the angle question. We'll come back to that in the next chapter. There's something you haven't learned yet that really would come into play on that. So we'll just look at the segment questions. So on this segment question, if I wanted the length of BD, I want to consider what BD is. And if I look closely, I realize that B is a midpoint, D is a midpoint, so BD is a mid-segment. And if it's a mid-segment, I know it's worth half of the side it's parallel to. And in that case, that means it's worth half of AE. So BD is equal to half of AE. And in this picture, I can see that AE is worth 17. So 1/2 of 17 tells me that BD is worth 8.5. Good, great, wonderful. Next slide. Okay, so on this one, you can cross out number 3 because we're not talking about the angles right now. So let's just look at the segments. They want us to find segment ED, and I know ED is a mid-segment because it goes from midpoint E to midpoint D. If it's a mid-segment, I know it is not only parallel to BC, but it's half the measure of BC. And they're telling me that from B to C is a full length of 20. So ED is equal to 1/2 of BC, which means it's worth 1/2 of 20, which means ED equals 10. Any questions? Just kidding, I can't answer them. You can come see me later if you have any. Let's look at AB. If I want the length of AB, I acknowledge that it's the side of the triangle and it corresponds with mid-segment FD. AB is going to be worth 2 times mid-segment FD, which means it's 2 times 7, which makes AB 14. Good. Great. Moving on. Now, what if we have expressions representing our pieces? Well, the process and the concept doesn't change. I have a midsegment. I know I have a midsegment because I acknowledge this is a midpoint and this is a midpoint, and this segment is connecting two midpoints. So that means that segment, n plus 14, is equal to half of the side it's parallel to, which is 3n plus 12. Now, while that's true, I can also look at this from the other point of view. That side, 3n plus 12, is equal to 2 times the midsegment, n plus 14. Now take a look at both equations, make sure they make sense to you, and decide which one is probably nicer to work with. Hopefully you realize the bottom one is nicer, because if I distribute the 1/2, I'm going to wind up with a fraction here, and who wants to use a fraction if they don't have to? If I distribute here, I'm still working with nice solid whole numbers, and let's do that. So let's use this. I'll erase this one. Move this up so I can work with it. And so I have 3n plus 12 equals 2n plus 28. Subtract 2n from both sides. Subtract 12 from both sides. And we have n is 16. I look back to the problem to see if I'm done, and it turns out I am. Find the value of n. Well, there it is. So I would like you to please try and pause the video here for a second. Try this problem out on your own, and then press play and see if you got it right. Okay, so when you come back to this video, hopefully you got that n equals 4. If you have that n equals 4, you can move on, just skip ahead a little bit, but here's your quick explanation. 6n, that side is equal to 2 times midsegment n plus 8. So 6n equals 2n plus 16, which means if I subtract the 2n, I have 4n equals 16, which gives me n equals 4. Hopefully we're good with that. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, triangle XYZ is the midsegment triangle. Pause. That's because XY is a midsegment, YZ is a midsegment, and XZ is a midsegment. So I have the midsegment triangle. What is the perimeter of triangle XYZ? Well, to find the perimeter of a triangle, it means I'm going to add up all the sides of the triangle. Right now, I know one side of that triangle. I know YZ is 3, so I need to identify the measure of the other two sides. Well, let's look at XY. XY, I know, is going to be half the measure of the side it's parallel to, which is UW. And if UW is 9, I know XY is 4.5. I also need XZ, which is parallel and half the parallel to and half the measure of VW. If VY is 4, then YW is 4, which means this entire side is 8, making XZ also 4. Once again, to find perimeter, add up all the sides you have. 4 plus 3 plus 4.5 gives us a perimeter of 11.5. Now I know the slide does not ask for the perimeter of the other triangle, but I want to find that too. I just want to point something out. So if I look now for the perimeter of UVW, well, so far I know that UW is 9. I know that VW is 8. UVW, and I can figure out that UV is 6. I know that UV is going to be 6 because its midsegment correlation is YZ, which is 3. So VW is going to be double VZ, or YZ. I hope that made sense. It's been a long day. Okay, so to find the perimeter of this, I have 6 plus 8 plus 9, which gives me a perimeter of 23. And now what is the relationship between my perimeter of 11.5 and my perimeter of 23? Well, hopefully you notice that if I multiply 11.5 by 2, I get 23, which means my mid-segment's perimeter is half the measure of the overall perimeter, or the overall perimeter is double the mid-segment perimeter. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to skip this slide because, oopsie, Mrs. Martinez used the same problem in your homework. So please cross that out, ignore that. And your homework for this section is going to be the page 39 that we stapled into your packet. You're doing that 1 through 7. And then on page 40, you're doing 8 through 13. You're actually crossing out number 10, 14, and 15 on your packet on page 40. So cross out 10, 14, and 15. Remember, we skipped the angle questions, so you can skip them on the homework. If you're good with this, please move on to your next video.